Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody, for being here. You having a good time at South by so far? Yeah? All right, this is apparently I just heard the hottest March 10 on record for Austin. So last night we were here for a pre-party, and we didn't know if we'd have AC. So I had a whole joke prepared of welcoming you to the hottest panel at South by. But we'll still go with it. I'm Jeff Sorensen, co-founder of Optimize and director for social innovation for the University of Michigan College of LSA. And we are here to talk about education. I think it's a really important time to be talking about this issue, as evidenced by the fact that so many of us are here. How many of you are from Michigan? How many of you are not from Michigan? All right, thanks for joining us. We're glad that you're here. Like I said, I think this is a really important time to be talking about education. There's a lot going on right now, even in the news about education. We know that the West Virginia teachers had one of the most significant teacher strikes in recent memory, won a 5% pay raise and access to insurance. But it's not just about how we treat teachers. There's huge questions around how do we prepare students for the future that we're actually moving toward, and is our current education system doing that? And that's everything from our students being prepared for the jobs that are actually out in the workforce right now. And then it's also a bigger question of, are we prepared to take on the massive challenges we have, like climate change, threats of nuclear war, massive challenges that we have going on right now? Are we preparing students to deal with this world? And so we've got a really interesting panel here that's going to be talking about this. I'm here from a traditional education institution. We've got a lot of people who are doing really interesting education work from outside of traditional institutions. So we'll start with Skot Welch. You want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go on down?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Skot Welch, founder of Mosaic Film Experience, which is essentially we use filmmaking as a creative platform for high school kids to do creative problem solving, collaboration, critical thinking, but we prepare them for careers in the future. And we're into our 7th year now out of Grand Rapids, and we really have a good time letting kids, we believe in just the amazing capacity of our young people, so that's what we've been doing now. So we'll get more into it later.
Hey. I'm a Longhorn alum, so I just have to throw these up.
Any other Longhorn alums here?
Any? Yay!
There you go.
My name's Trudy Ngo-Brown. I'm also from Grand Rapids. I'm from West Michigan Center for Arts and Technology, and I oversee the teen programs that we have, and we do after-school programming for students in Grand Rapids in the visual arts and technology. And we serve primarily students in Grand Rapids public schools, and we also believe that we provide a platform for students to a platform where students can elevate their voices through creativity, and love what I get to do. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Damien. I work with a company called Circus. I'm originally from Australia, moved to Detroit back in 2009, which was kind of an interesting time to be in the city. And so what we do is we run coding boot camps, which, you know, if any of you have worked in tech, you're kind of familiar with the idea. It's this idea of training people that are interested in technology in sort of immersive multi-week programs. So our particular boot camps are 12 weeks long, and they take you from zero to a job, software development.
All right. So this is we're going to kind of let this be a free-flowing conversation, but the general theme I think that we want to talk about is what are some of the general themes and trends of, before we get into talking about education of the future, of education from the 20th century. What is it that this looks like, and where might it not be serving students as well as it needs to for the current demands of the future? Just a little question to start off.
Well, when you think about 20th century education, it was a mechanized model. So it was about really cogs in the machine, kind of the Frederick Taylor style of management. And so it was about replaceable parts, and those people became replaceable parts during that time. I kind of look at it as bricks versus stones. Bricks are replaceable, they're very uniform, but we don't live in a brick economy, we live in a stone economy, and where stone has its own unique place, and if the stone is missing from the wall, it's hard to rebuild it with the exact replica. So I think the 20th century was about the mechanization of work and people as cogs. 21st century is more around problem solving. So it's not about just, it's harder to replace a person if you're running an organization well. it's there. You encourage design thinking. You encourage problem solving. You encourage debate. And so I think where people were machines or treated like machines back in the 21st or 20th century, I think now we're really looking at the specific kind of capacity of the individual and trying to make sure that, because if you can grow their capacity, you can grow your organization, or they can grow their community, whatever that is. But the point is for problem solvers and kind of stones versus bricks this is my thought so far.
Yeah, it's like we were talking about this last night a little bit about how, like, the 20th century education was basically trying to make humans more into machines.
Yeah.
But now we have machines that are better at being machines than humans are. And as artificial intelligence improves, we shouldn't try to be better at being robots than the robots.
Yeah.
But there's opportunities to be more human than robots, right? Absolutely. Yeah. Before going too far down that line, I'd love for both of you, maybe Trudy
I
or
think
Damien.
I agree completely. I mean, I think the thing that sort of characterises it for me, it was kind of built on the Industrial Revolution, right? And it was really about, kind of a single path or a very homogenous way of viewing people, right? Everybody kind of got the same education. You're with a bunch of people your age, you get fed some information, then you kind of move to the next stage, you get fed some more information, and it's sort of very much progressed without thinking a whole lot about the individual needs of the students and really trying to understand like what people are good at, what they're interested in, and really trying to find that intersection. So for me, that's sort of a function of what you're talking about.
I would add too, it was, what are you interested in? That's the one track you're on for the next 30 years, and your career is around that. And I think the workplace has changed, and it's not very common that you're in the same career for that long, for 30 years anymore, and it's more of this gig economy, a freelance economy, where industries are changing rapidly because of artificial intelligence or whatnot, and so you have to be more flexible. You have to be able to market yourself and be able to reinvent yourself quickly. Those are the people that bounce back when industries shut down, and so we see that more. And just talking to students about, okay, you're going to choose an area, but recognize that you might have to choose another area at some point, and that's okay. So the job that your grandpa had or your grandma had, where they were there for 25 or 30 years at the plant or with an organization, that's just not the way that it is anymore. And so I think that's a shift, I think, of education trying to respond to that too.
Yeah. It's interesting that we're all talking about how people have to be able to be, it has to be more individualized, and you have to be more flexible and adaptable. But at the same time, there's this backdrop of education becoming more standardized than ever in a lot of ways, where teacher pay and whether you're even going to have a job or whether your school's going to stay open is becoming more and more aggressively tied to standardized testing. I don't know if any of you, I know that you actually used to be a teacher in public schools, right? You told me an interesting story last night about, well, maybe just comment on that, and then I'll ask about the story.
Think about that story. No, just I think I have a lot of friends that are still in K-12, and it's a tough time to be in public education. I think everybody knows that, whether you are in the classroom or not. The expectations that the teachers do everything, and now talk about also being armed and ready. Well, that's another conversation, but I mean, they're being tasked to do a lot. And on top of that, these high-stakes testing. And I think the pendulum is starting to shift, and parents are starting to demand, hey, this is not good for my child, because I recognize what they need to be ready for. And circling A, B, or C is really not pushing them and preparing them. And so I think that's a good thing. And I think we're starting to shift away from that desire to measure success through standardized testing. I think with that, encouraging the parents to be more involved, the communities to be more involved, and have a say in what we want for our kids is. We talked about that yesterday. What is it that what kind of education do we want? What future do we want for our students? I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
So all three of you are working in places outside of traditional schools, though. So I'm curious, with the students that you see, in whatever ways you're trying to provide essentially support that's not there in the traditional classrooms for them. In what ways do you see that students are really potentially not getting what you think they need to be getting inside the classroom, and how are your organizations trying to address that in different ways? Maybe we'll start here with Skot again.
Well, I think where we are in terms of education is where not all teachers. I come from a public educator background as well with my parents and family, but I think we have analog teaching methodology teaching digital kids. And so classroom, oftentimes, not in all instances, is the only place where they can't really change there's really not a large opportunity to interact as they do with their devices outside. So I didn't start Mosaic because of film, because of the consulting firm that I own. I just hear my clients talking to me in my ears about having talent that is ready and they're problem solvers. And it's not about ABC or attendance-based compensation, but when you hire someone, have them come in and actually solve a problem. And I just thought that's something that we don't see in the schools. In fact, Dirk, who's vice chair of Mosaic, what we found is in our city, there's really no collective hub in terms of after-school programs. And so Mosaic, our focus is to just try to work well with others and to fill gaps that schools can't. And to Trudy's point, educators are some of the hardest working, yet the most underpaid. And so we really come alongside of the teachers and the districts to say, let's fill in the gaps together. It's not because, bad district. It's like, how do we work together on this? And we found that by making hard work fun for the kids through kind of connecting with Hollywood and bringing local professionals together, they're interested. And we show them the power of what they have in their hand through the mobile device. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those things where we find that we work with the same students that Trudy works with, and I'm sure Damien, because these are public school kids, but the goal is to give them something in their hand, give them a really good jolt of success, and then let them know that there's a career connected to that if you follow the discipline all the way through, and then bring those connections to them. To meet the guy that designs the costumes for Black Panther, Wrinkle in Time, like he's right there. He'll sit with you until you're done talking with him. And so we just want our kids, particularly public school kids, because generally I think they're the afterthought, unfortunately. We want to give them the best stuff. And so, that's what I think, is in line with the missions with Damien and Trudy as well. But that's kind of how we approach it.
Yeah, I think having come from traditional K-12 structures and then moving into after-school programming, what I love about it is, again, it's not that the schools can't do it or they're failing in some way. I see it as we're an extension of the classroom. We're just down the hallway from them. And students have a place where it's outside of the school space. We're located elsewhere, and they love that. It's like they get to take a break. They get to relax a little bit. We don't have high-stakes testing. We don't have some of these rules that are in place for K-12 programs. And so I think that's where out-of-school time programming comes in and can fill those gaps and let students have some choice. No one's telling them they have to come do an art class, or they have to go take a film class, or go do some kind of sport to fill in some checkbox. The students that we get are students who elect to come. They're following their interests, and they have a space where they can flourish and work alongside teaching artists, in our case, who are in their industries and become mentors. And they get to work closely in a small teacher to student ratio that they do not get in the classroom. And they can't, and that's not, again, not any fault of any school district or any administration. It's just that's not possible. And so what I love about our programs is that they give high contact, high impact experiences for students to explore and figure out what their passions are and explore what they could make of it. We don't tell them that there's only one track, but we show them all of the options, we show them the menu, and then we encourage them to make the choice that's right for them. And so I think that's where our type of programming can fill those gaps that they might not have, and we have mentors that they trust and can help kind of guide that way for them.
So I guess I'm a little different to Trudy in the sense that most of the work we do is with adults. And we see kind of two types. We see career changes, people that want to get into tech, because as you guys know, you're here, tech's hot. Lots of jobs, It's a path that kind of puts you on a high-paying, high-growth job. Or we see people that have studied tech and can't get a job. So mostly out of sort of community college or associate's degree type qualifications. And so the market failure that brings people to us, I think the first category that I mentioned, they don't want to go back to school and spend a ton of money, right? So it's not accessible. And I think the other side to it is that, especially with the people that are studying computer science, the feedback that they're getting from employers is that their skills aren't altogether relevant. They want to see more practice. They want to see that there's more of a kind of a connection to the sort of work they'll be doing on the job. So they're kind of the two messages we consistently get from people that come and take our programs.
It's interesting that you're talking about students who maybe are struggling in other contexts and find more success in your programs. I'm curious about the two of you working more with high schoolers. Are the students that are in your programs, I know you can't, there's probably a wide range, but is it typically students who are having a really hard time in traditional classrooms and are finding something new in creating a film or using design thinking processes to address problems? Or do you think it's more students who are actually doing pretty well already and are seeing this as another kind of thing to add to what they're doing?
At WMCAT, we definitely have a diverse range. We have both. We have kids who are in IB programs that see us as a place where they can take a deep breath from all of the requirements that are in such a rigorous curriculum. We've got students who don't have access to the equipment and these type of offerings in their own schools, and so they come to us to explore. When they see ceramics, it's like, oh, I don't really, how do I make that mug? Or a movie? I'm interested in creating a documentary or doing public art, I like to draw, but what else can I do with it? So we've got definitely a range of students who are looking to fill a gap, whether it's of access or just to explore something new, and probably a combination of both, I would say.
I'd say the same thing. We see just a broad range of students, and I also think what we tend to find is that, and we knew that, people learn differently. Students learn differently. There are at least 12 different learning styles. One of the coolest books I've read around education was from Sir Ken Robinson called The Element. Just really fun, because it wasn't, his hypothesis was, it's not about how smart are you, but how are you smart? Right, and so you have kids making films, and if they're in a class during the day, to Trudy's point, where they're teaching in a style where the kid doesn't learn that way, the kid can actually leave that class feeling like they're stupid, right? It's really that they just haven't connected with this teaching style of the teachers. And when I teach teachers, I tell them to be kind of intellectually ambidextrous, right? Be able to flow, be able to adjust to the kids in your room. Your goal is to get them what they need at all costs, right? So change if you have to change. And so we see a variety of different types of kids, for Mosaic Film Experience. And we initially, too, by our third year, we had 750 films submitted from 46 countries. And that would be success I think in many books. In my book, it was a failure because we only had 2 films from Michigan. So we actually stopped the entire international component of Mosaic. It is localized now. And through our digital platform we're building with Brightly, we're going to reach kids around the world, but that's allow them to do their own localized Mosaic. So our first beta test is in Nairobi, Kenya this October, but it's going to be Nairobi, working with kids from Nairobi. And we'll connect the kids from Nairobi to kids in Grand Rapids, but we're not trying to make the kids in Nairobi, Grand Rapidians, nor are we trying to do vice versa. But the thing is, kids learn differently, and I think we also should we should listen to kids more as they tell us what they need, because they do know. And I think a lot of times adults, we get into this thing where we know it's best for the kids. I don't think that's the case all the time. And our kids have much more capacity than we give them credit for. And so that's what drives Mosaic, is to find out what the kids, how they learn, let them actually run with it, finance it, look at it, and make sure that we can tie it to something that can lead to a brighter future for them in their careers.
And I would just add, I think the thing that our students do, they have choice pretty much in that content. They're getting a chance to express themselves. And for most of our studios, there's an opportunity for them to have their own project, their own thing that they have control over, creative control over. And I don't think in their traditional school day, there's a lot of opportunity for that. And I think that's what really drives their participation and their engagement in programs like ours.
Yeah, you read my mind, because I was just going to touch on that a little bit, that the students that we work with, and I actually realized I didn't explain at all what I do, but Optimize is basically a social impact incubator on college campuses. So we help students start their own self-directed projects that aren't just trying to be a one-term project for school, but really are trying to turn it into sustainable endeavors, whether that's a nonprofit or a company or a student organization, all aim to make the world more just and sustainable. So taking on social impact, environmental impact, and we provide training, mentorship, and funding for them to do that. And we now work with hundreds of students every year, but I start to see these patterns where, so I'm at a university that's very difficult to get into, and that could be something we could talk about too, is access to this kind of stuff. But even the students who are doing well, who are passing their classes, doing extremely well in their classes, oftentimes get to universities and have gotten so good at doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and jumping through this hoop and that hoop and that hoop, so that they can get to the next thing and get to a good school and then ideally get a good job, and that's supposedly, as far as, that's the good life. That people actually have no idea what they would do if they were asked, well, if you could just do something, what would you do? If you could change something, what would you change? What would you want to work on? And one of the biggest things that we have to do as an organization is just break people out of this mindset that someone's going to tell you how to build your self-directed project, or that there's one way to succeed, or that I, as the director of the program, can tell you if you're a success or not. Like, it's not up to me, right? And it's not up to, it's up to everyone you're working with. But I see this as a huge problem, that even the most successful students are so used to just following external standards that might or might not mean anything. And I think it shows in what students with the most access to resources choose to do. There's a book called Excellent Sheep that shows that some ridiculous number, like 50% of Princeton graduates end up going into finance. And it's like, it's not because they're all passionate about finance, maybe some of them are, and it's not because they all believe that finance is the way to change the world. It's because people are like, well, I don't know what the hell else to do, so I might as well make a lot of money, right? Like, I'm going to go into this. Do you all see that in the work that you do at the different stages, that people are very kind of drilled into these standardized processes and external motivations? And what does that look like in the work that you do?
I can take a crack. I think this is probably more for you guys. I think, yes, see it a lot in the work that I do. Is this working? Yeah, people are changing careers because they're miserable, right? They've gone onto a path and maybe have made up their mind or had some story, as you described it, they were kind of following. And it's interesting, like when you ask the question about the 20th century education and some themes at high level, I think this story kind of developed, which was, go to school, get good grades in high school, go to college, and then you get a nice middle-class job, right? It's like a single path. And I don't know, that's just become the mindset that people have. And you almost have this idea that, like, if you don't do it a certain way, you're going to fail. So I think that is a real problem. That's kind of what we see ultimately.
There's also the fact that those middle-class jobs aren't there anymore. Yeah,
right.
It's a serious thing.
I think, for some of our students, they see themselves as the path out for their families. So I'm trying to think about that in the context of your question too, because I think there's this line between, and I heard this maybe last fall from someone who was in the music industry, and she was trying to teach teens about music production. And you've got some artists who are there to really pour out their soul and make these artistic creations that might not be really lucrative in the end for them. And she said, I have to teach them that you've got, at some point, you're feeding your soul and you're also feeding your family. And so there's this tension, right, between the two of them. And so I think about, that's what I kind of thought about with that question of like, okay, maybe take the Princeton grads out of it, but you're always having that tension of following your passion or feeding your soul. If you had two circles, that middle part would be that sweet spot of where you want to be, and you're feeding your soul and feeding your family at the same time. So I think when I think about some of our students, I think I want to do well, and I want to do right by my family. I want to support them, and so we show them what the game is, because at some point they need to play the game to get ahead. But then how do you freestyle after you know the game? And that's kind of another skill to have too, because they have to be able to do both, I think. So I don't know if that answered it, but that's kind of where my mind went with that question.
I think that's a great point too, because I don't think that it's unjustified for students to try to meet the standards that are set out for them, especially in cases where the stakes are very high. And it kind of gets to the question that we were talking about over email a little bit, of this tension between, should the education of the future be much more focused on job preparation, preparing people very pragmatically for the jobs that are available and trying to do that, or should there be this element of, kind of the tradition of liberal education, of feeding your soul, elevating yourself, intellectually as high as you can? I'd be curious to hear, any of your thoughts on that.
I kind of feel like we're at the point now, if we're not careful, it's like we've trained kids for years to play basketball, and they showed up and it was a football game, right? They're perfectly equipped for the wrong solution. And so, not saying that it's not their fault, right? I think one of the gifts that we could give to all kids, and even to adults, that Damien sees all the time, and which is what he's doing, and that is help people to think like entrepreneurs, whether they work for themselves or for somebody else. So you can either add value in terms of what you provide as a service or a product entrepreneurially, or you can work inside of an organization that has an environment where you can create value, which is an entrepreneur. And so, but the point is the thinking patterns, the thinking processes, the skills that you can provide by thinking like that, I think that will we will just really serve our students wonderfully if we can just at least give them that. The standardized tests kind of put them into this box, and so when they show up, because the system doesn't work, you show up. I mean, there are a lot of MBAs without jobs, right? There are a lot of grads without jobs. So we know that system just does not work. But I tell you what, you find somebody that hustles, that knows how to solve problems, they will always have a job. And I think that really goes to this whole idea of helping students to think, and even people who are retooling their careers, think entrepreneurially, think entrepreneurially, and you will really, I think, you'll have a better go at it.
That kind of, I wonder if you could tell that story that you told me last night about how when you were a teacher and kind of the understanding of the needs of the business world, and kind of how you've seen that from your perspective as a public school teacher, and now someone who's working in a non-traditional, or sort of outside the traditional institutions kind of education program.
Yeah, so before I came to WMCAT, like I said, I was working in K-12, and part of what we did was professional development for teachers. And I worked specifically in career readiness and workforce development. And part of what I did was trying to connect teachers to industry. And what I do is connect with local employers and bring teachers to those employers and learn about what's going on in advanced manufacturing, what's going on in the health sciences, what's going on in tech. And it was always, the feedback was always, this is so eye-opening. And I think traditionally, teachers go from school as students, and then they almost immediately go right back into the classroom. And so their own practical experience, unless they're career changers themselves, are relatively limited. And so unless it's someone through their own personal networks, or they do something in the summers, their view outside of education is limited. So when a student says, why do I need to learn this? They don't really have a solid answer, right? So they're like, I think you're gonna use this algebra or algebra 2 and these equations and differentials, and I don't know the last time I did. It might have been in my sophomore year. in my math class. And so it was really, I thought it was great. And then the teachers who went, I mean, they got to see, okay, my idea of advanced manufacturing is not this dirty factory. It's actually pretty high tech and requires some skills. So I'm not going to talk Damien out of this career anymore because I have this bias or misinformation about what this career is. I'm going to see that maybe he has aptitude for some, like he's very technical and very hands-on. And so I might say, hey, why don't you consider this or look into this? And so it just gives teachers a little bit more context for when they're giving advice to students. And so we don't have it, I don't think there's enough of that. And I think that's what I was kind of trying to explain. It's like, so we have teachers, again, through no fault of their own, they're in this position to guide and maybe they don't have the full context about what that world next step outside of high school or college is. Maybe not as accurate as it could be.
So we've got about 10 minutes until I want to go out to the audience because I think you all are going to have more interesting questions than I will. But let's take at least a couple minutes here and talk about kind of the second half of this that we wanted to talk about, which is what do we think about the future? What are the skills and perspectives that people are going to need? And I guess I'll maybe want to start with you, Damien, because as someone who's working in the way that you are, I'm sure you've already, even just since Grand Circus started, seen changes in what people need. Even just in this one area, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. One of the challenges we have, it's both kind of a challenge and sort of a reason we're successful, is that with technology changing the way, the pace of change driven by technology is kind of really reduced the half-life on skills. If you're a software developer, you have about 12 to 18 months before your skills are somewhat obsolete. And so I think back to the question you were asking before about getting someone work ready versus focusing on maybe some of the the outcomes of a liberal education. I think that it's definitely important to get people ready for that change and to be able to adapt. And I think that's where these critical thinking skills and all these kind of positive outcomes you get out of a liberal education are important. So I think that the thing that we try to do at Grand Circus, and then we look for people that are lifelong learners, and we try to encourage that, because the reality is, like, you take a boot camp with us, your skills they're going to get you a job, but they're not going to be that relevant. So if you're not thinking that way, you're going to be screwed in 18 months.
Do you ever see people come back to you because they feel like, how do I update my skills, or is that not?
Not as much as you'd think. I mean, we have shorter classes. Sort of our boot camps are 10 to 12 weeks long, and then we have workshops which are much shorter. I mean, people will come back and refresh or learn advanced topics, but for the most part, they're teaching themselves. Which is kind of the goal.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, that's actually one of the tenets of liberal education, is being able to teach yourself, right? Learning how to learn. It's a very unsatisfying answer for kids to hear a lot of times. Like, as you said, why do I need to know this? Because you need to learn how to learn, Yeah,
and we're telling them all the time, we do college visits or things after, and we're telling them, you're going to need to learn, whether keep being a learner, whether you're going to CC for a 2-year program, a 4-year program, an accreditation, some other apprenticeship, whatever you're doing, there's not one track, but you need to be ready to always be learning, always be a learner, have that learner mindset, because that's going to serve you well, just like Skot said.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it is. It's just trying to help them learn how to think, and it will really, really serve them well. And as I always say, our goal is not to create the next Spike Lee or Spielberg, but if we can create an amazing innovator, maybe an amazing educator, but certainly someone that wherever they land, they're going to add value. And so I think that is kind of the next thing. We realize that this kind of box-type educational system, it doesn't serve where they're going, because I think some of the things are where they're going. I mean, that's a future that we're not even sure of ourselves. But if we can give them a skill set in terms of how to think and to be lifelong learners, that is something that will never grow old, and it will serve them, I think, through all the years.
Something just on that, the lifelong learner thing, something I read recently which was kind of scary. So for our kids, if you're in an elementary school right now, 65% of kids will be working in a job that doesn't exist. And I think the expectation is that they're going to have 4 to 5 different careers. And that's not 4 to 5 jobs. That's 4 to 5 different careers. So how do you build a platform for that future? I mean, it's insane.
I was having a conversation with a colleague, and he does career services for university. He said, "Well, Scott, what do you think was the number one thing that, as Trudy, as she kind of helped connect the college, with the talent, the student?" This guy asked me. He said, "So, what do you think is the thing they had like 7 years? What do you think they asked me for all the time in employers 5 to 6 years ago?" And he said, analytical ability. He said, "What do you think it is now?" And because he knew he was going to have lunch with me, like, wow, cool. He said, "It's storytelling." I was like, no. And here's a guy that with this great team, you've got a great, a film experience for kids, but storytelling. But I think when you think about that in a broader kind of 30,000-foot view, it makes a lot of sense. Because you have to communicate vision if you're going to sell a strategic plan. If you're going to lead an organization, lead a team, you've got to cast the vision with clarity. If you're going to write something, you have to have writing skills to articulate the plan so that the team can run with it. So, yeah, actually, storytelling skills are a very integral part, I think, in success. So I think if we can give them an entrepreneurial mindset and skill sets and then help them or to teach them how to tell stories and to do storytelling well, I think you have at least a beginning of something that can really provide strength for them for the future.
Yeah, and it kind of gets into the same kind of, both of those points get into the same question of, are we trying to be more like robots and outdo them, or are we trying to be more human? And at least for me, I think one of the most important things for students to learn is not only how to prepare for whatever jobs might be available that don't get taken over by machines, but also to sort of dictate what are these careers, what are the careers that are available? Not just how do I prepare myself to get into one, but how do we as people, as more and more things get taken over by machines, actually still play a role in deciding how things get done in a society? And if you ask kids what they want to do, they almost always talk about these kinds of things. There was a team that we funded that worked with 10-year-olds in Peru. The student that was from Peru, so she went back and they did STEM labs, after-school STEM labs with these students, and brought down Arduinos and they did a biotech kind of thing and just introduced technologies that these students had never seen. And they said, "We think the best way for you to learn this is to pick a project that you care about and then try to apply this technology to it." And what did they choose? I think a lot of us would think, oh, they're 10 years old, they won't know anything meaningful to apply this to. But they chose to build landslide detectors because Peru had some of the worst landslides in its history because of El Niño Costero that has been devastating Peru. Climate change is not a future problem for Peru. They were doing things to help farmers with flooding because of similar issues. They were building prosthetic hands for people that they knew. So I think that engaging students and asking them what would they want to do starts to build that personal power of saying, I don't want to just get pushed around by wherever robots are. We want to have a say in what the future of society looks like.
I said a little bit earlier about teaching the kids the game and how to play it and then work outside of it, but then it's also creating their own game, creating a new game. And I think that's another, that makes me think about the voice that they have. And sometimes we as adults forget that they are very capable and have things that they care about that are just as meaningful. And if given a platform to express that and to exercise that, we're hearing more about teen voice again in recent news and their power. I think it's how do we as adults create those pathways for them to do that and listen too.
Yeah. So this is my first time ever moderating a panel, so I don't know how well it went. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, but I think certainly your questions will be better than mine even. So let's turn it over to you. Any questions from the crowd? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Guy from Brazil. Congratulations, panel. Trudy, in your West Michigan
Center for Arts and Technology.
Okay.
You could say WMCAT.
Okay, WMCAT. How do you offer the digital content, or how do the kids learn using the digital kids learn?
How do we do it?
Yeah.
So all of our instructors are teaching artists or professionals connected to the studios that we offer. So we do traditional fine arts like ceramics, photography, illustration, fashion design, and video production, audio production, game design as well. And so we have staff who are knowledgeable in that content, and they develop the projects that and work alongside students to create projects that are interesting to them.
But they're using digital devices to learn with?
Yeah, and we have in our video production studio, they're using real video cameras and using Adobe Premiere to edit. Our video game design students are using Unreal, which is a software engine to create the art in video games. So we try as much as possible to give them access to what industry is using. Yeah.
And then for Mosaic Film Experience, ours takes place. We do essentially 9 in the morning till 2 p.m. on 2 days in November. We have the public school system and then the broader school district. And they cannot enter into the contest unless they shoot and submit their film on a digital device. But then also they go, and we award them for that during those 2 days. But then we do coding, workshops, game design. We're also getting into some things around financial literacy as well. Because we want, to help them with the whole package. And so they have all different types of workshops. And then we also have right now 9 different programs, after-school programs, and we work with WMCAT already. One of the things we do is we actually do 6 weeks in terms of media literacy, helping young kids to really find their voice in terms of how to be better consumers and creators of content. And then we also just launched something called the Mosaic Film Experience YouTube project. To Jeff's point, allow them to kind of do their own thing, as Trudy was talking about as well. So what we do is we provide the platform. It's curated, but we let the kids actually own that channel, and they're the voice for 2 weeks, and they can interact with their public through their own channel. And then Mosaic provides that. We essentially provide the guardrails, but we let the kids drive the car. And so that's one of the things. Those are some of the things that we're doing right now with them.
I'll just add a quick comment, not as the moderator, but just as someone who's here. I think that we know that having access to current technologies is really important for current education, and yet so many of our public schools have like one computer for 50 students, and the roofs are falling down, and like it's just like a shitty situation for anyone to be in. And so public education investment has been declining in the U.S. for a while now. And I think it's not surprising that students who have access to this kind of stuff learn better and develop better than others. Yeah.
Hi guys, my name is Phil. I'm with Ann Arbor Spark from Michigan, born and raised in Detroit. I went through DPS, Detroit Public Schools, from kindergarten to 9th grade. It's widely known that it's kind of a failing school system. You guys mentioned lack of resources, so I remember being in a class of 60 kids in a science class, and my science seat was on the sink, basically on a counter. And once I got to that point, I was able to. My mom saw that and said, "Not the best situation," and found another school like University Prep, where I was able to take part of some of the things that you offer through Mosaic. So thank you for that. But I guess my question is, what type of barriers have you seen dealing with Detroit Public Schools? Damien, I know you've dealt with many different DPS schools. What type of barriers have you seen, and how do you feel, what can we do to overcome some of those problems that the kids are experiencing due to lack of resources in low-income areas?
We try to democratize access as much as possible. So when we first started the Mosaic Film Experience, in fact, we put it out there for kids around the world, and kids from Brazil said, you know what, $25 to enter a film, that's just crazy. And I'd even been to a film festival yet, so I was like, is that right? And the team's like, yeah, that's kind of, they said, well, but you just charge, you have to charge a fee. I said, well, why? I said, okay, how about we get businesses to underwrite that and make it free for the kids? And so the other thing is we had kids from private schools really winning because they had, tons of great equipment there. And I don't fault them for, having that at their disposal. But we wanted to give all kids a much broader opportunity. And so that's where we said, okay, you can't enter into the experience unless you shoot it on a mobile device. And the reason we did that is, again, to at least somehow affect socioeconomic barriers so that more kids could participate, because 86% of kids have mobile devices at their disposal. And so wherever we find those types of barriers, making it inexpensive for the schools to even participate, right? Making sure the lunch is good, but it's cheap when they and it doesn't cost the school district a lot. So we look at it as we try to flatten it wherever we can, give them the opportunity they can, and then partner with amazing organizations and volunteers, and things in our city and around the world. I mean, Mosaic Film Experience, we accept help from any place on the planet that's willing to help our kids, right? That's it. And we play well with others, as I always say. So it's about knocking down those barriers.
I can only speak to Grand Rapids Public Schools because that's where we're based, and I can think about the partnerships that we have that have helped to overcome some of the traditional barriers that might exist in other districts. We have a great partnership with the district. They help provide transportation. You can have these great programs, but how are they going to get to them? So we have solved the transportation barrier by working with the district. They bus directly from the schools to our location in downtown Grand Rapids, and then we have bus passes that we give students so then they can get home. Another partnership that we have is with our local YMCA, and they help provide our community dinners each night. And so we also know that as students come in, we want to make sure that they at least have some food while they're in our space, and we can provide that. We have a partnership with Arbor Circle, which provides all of our students with access to mental health services as well, because that's another thing that is on students' plates. And sometimes in a high school, when you've got a guidance counselor with a ratio of 1 to 700 students, it's not, we try to make it a lot easier. So that's another thing that we do. And so I think to overcome those barriers, you can't do it alone, and it's seeking those partnerships with organizations that can support those gaps that you might have, and working alongside leveraging resources that you have with other organizations to create something instead of feeling like you have to go at it alone.
I'm getting a little out of my swim lane because we do mostly with adults. But when we've worked with kids, outside of the stuff that you've talked about, which is hugely important. Can they get there? Do they feel safe? Have they been fed? All that stuff, which a lot of us take for granted, is hugely important. But for me, what we found has been really impactful when it comes to coding is just exposure. Right? It's kind of like we talked about earlier about offering these paths up to kids. So we've done a lot of basic HTML. I don't know if so Phil used to work at Grand Circus. So I don't know if you were at Grand Circus when we used to do basic HTML, CSS classes for kids, and the transformation you see in some of these kids when they see that this is possible for them, firstly that they can do it, and then they see the career that's possible for them is amazing. So I think that's a lot of what we can do, but I don't want to minimise all the other stuff, which is enormous.
And I think that we were talking about this a little last night, that it's really wonderful when one institution or one school is able to create partnerships that bring in more resources and provide access to resources for the kids there. But there's still all the other schools in the state. This needs to be something that's available to everyone. So I think, we should spend less money on war and more money on education. We should stop thinking of education as something to make money and as something that we need as a public good for our society to thrive. We had a $1.7 billion deficit that we made cuts into education in this state. Governor Rick Snyder did this. And at the same time, did about $1.7 billion in tax cuts to corporations at the same time. So there's no way to not get political with education, but we're spending a lot of money on resources that if you ask the majority of Americans, should the money be going here or should it be going to provide quality education for our kids? I think a lot of people would say we should spend a little bit less money on wars in the Middle East and a little bit more on education.
Yeah, so I teach visual communication at a university, and I come across a lot of seniors who might be finance majors or who grew up people telling them that they're very creative, And they'd say, I say, what do you want to do when you graduate? Well, my dream job would be to be a creative director, make commercials or do something creative, create a program, create an app. But somehow there was a disconnect between the creative input they received as a high school or younger student that said, you're creative, here's some outlets for you to be creative, and then here's actually the steps you need to take. And I know there's many ways to get here at the South by Southwest conference and have an awesome creative career, but there seems to be a gap between here's about 6 or 7 or 8 paths to practically make it into a creative professional career. And there seems to be a disconnect where students aren't getting that kind of information early enough or at the right time to make that decision, and either have to find it later or end up in a path in maybe finance or in marketing where, wait, marketing isn't advertising or isn't graphic design, or so there's kind of that disconnect. And I'm wondering how you can address that, especially as you introduce them into creative field and cultivate that, but also show them that transition into a professional creative career.
One of our program objectives is actually around building students' creative confidence, and thinking about how the system kind of squelches that very early on. In our organization, there's several of us that have young children about the same age, and I remember talking to my executive director about this. He was like, oh, my daughter's so creative, and then my other colleague would be like, my daughter's so creative, look at what she did. And I'm thinking in my head, my daughter's creative too. And I don't think we have our kids are not we don't just happen to have the most creative girls in Grand Rapids, just happen to all know each other, right? I mean, all kids are naturally creative, and they want to create, and they have this desire to make something cool and show you and be affirmed. But somewhere along the way, there's an adult saying, well, this didn't meet this box, and and it just kills it. And then I go back I retreat into my shell, and I'm less likely to make. And then I try to find something safe, and I go into finance. Are there any finance people here? We're really beating up the finance people.
Been really beat up, bad.
We'll just keep dissing on it.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, I think that's a real critical thing of like what I hope that we do with all of our students is help them realize that, and I use that all the time, what you were saying, we're not creating the next Spielberg or Spike Lee or Ansel Adams or whoever, like this famous, we're not trying to develop fine artists in our programs. It's about thinking creatively, thinking as an artist, in whatever field you ultimately go in, because we think that will serve them even in a finance career very well. And what we've done is try to bring people from the creative sector locally to talk to students. The path from here to here is not linear, typically. And we have people come in to talk about how they went here, they made a connection, and then they did this and got this experience, leveraged that. I mean, because that's really how it happens. And we try to just tell students and expose them to how people are creative in a variety of sectors to help them understand that you can make a living doing something creative. And there's many ways to get there.
Yeah, also too, what we did, one of our great relationships we have is with HBO, and so we had Carla Moore, she was a senior vice president of talent acquisition from HBO. She's now the head of point of sale and head of education, ironically enough. So this is a great match made in heaven. But she came to speak to the kids, and she continues to come and speak, and it's pretty cool because they pay their own way, and then they bring a check with them for the kids. I'm like, why do you come here? I'm like, you can be anywhere. You've got so much work to do in New York City. Her department sees over 30,000 resumes a month, and she makes time to come to Mosaic. And so I'm not at all deceived in thinking that it's because something so magical and great. I'm like, but what's really going on here? She said, because I can get in front of 600 kids at one time and talk to them about stuff that has nothing to do with stuff in front of the camera, really. So what Carla talks to the kids about is all the credits in back of the film. She says, those are all your opportunities, and there are far more opportunities in back of the camera than in front of the camera. Accountants, construction, programming. She says, what do you think HBO on the go is? She said, it's coding, right? Then we bring Philip Boutte in, who's become a dear friend. He just, Black Panther, Wrinkle in Time, Inception, Westworld, you name it, Philip. And he comes in every year. He says, I want to talk to you not about the fancy stuff I do because I draw for a living. He says, what I want you to know is that you can actually draw and make a living. And I want to tell you about all the different careers that are involved. We brought in Ryan Stevens from Queen Sugar. He says, I just want to talk to you about tenacity, hard work, and grit. And so what they do is they're already doing what they've done. So we put that to the side because it's already very cool, but they come there to talk to the kids about the traits, the character, the principles that you can put in motion to really begin to lead their future. And that's where we find it really, it's pretty fun.
So I know we've got a couple more questions. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, so back there. Let's try to make maybe one person answer or something.
So obviously testing, I guess, is one way to help find out students' strengths and kind of career paths. So I was just wondering, for maybe ones that aren't doing so well in testing, are you using sort of psychometric, personality, like what attributes are you using to help people find their path?
Well, say the question again. What attributes? If
We didn't understand your
I
accent.
guess like one,
If not
in
testing.
the corporate world, you use kind of psychometric testing to help people find their kind of personality preferences or communication preferences, and then that leads to, you know, jobs like this might use these skills. So I was just kind of wondering, at a student level, and they're not so great at normal tests, how you help them find a career. Like, are you using personality attributes or, just sort of some way to help guide them and find their perfect puzzle piece to work on?
In our program, we're not using any kind of testing. I don't know if you're working with employers who do.
No, we don't. But I think that I don't know that you could devise a test to tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be so hard to do. So you're saying a test that would basically, you know, ask you a bunch of questions, and at the end of it, it would be, you should be a lawyer, you should be an artist. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There are definitely those tests out there. I mean, I've taken them, and they've always, you know, given me really bad advice. Yeah, in fact, you know, 10 years worth of my career kind of, you know, put me on. But, I mean, for me, the thing is, and this comes back to like, you know, Ken Robinson is awesome. I love that you mentioned him because he talks a lot about this. I think that something that we've gotten away from doing in K through 12 is really finding out what really gets kids excited and what they're good at. And I think the best way to do that is just to kind of take off the guardrails, expose them to a lot of different things, and let them kind of find their path a little more organically. I don't know if you do a test, you're gonna get the same result.
Yeah, we do something similar with. I mean, we're with college students, so it's a little different. But a lot of college students are totally lost also as to where they're going to go, and a lot of it's like start working on a project. What you start with doesn't have to be what you end with, but there's something to be said for if you're willing to work on something for 5 or 6 months. That's a clue to what you might be interested in. You know, like as if you're willing to put in that kind of work, then that means something. I think current education has ignored personal motivation way too much, and I don't think you can go all the way to the other side and say just do whatever you want all the time. But you need to have that spark, otherwise you're not going to have any. You know, we have another question I want to make sure we get to. Yeah, this might be the last one. Probably is.
Okay. Well, thank you. Given the framing of the conversation around Michigan and the fact that an educational leader from Michigan is now the Secretary of Education. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what we're in for, and if you could also offer a little bit of a vision, you know, given that you started with the question of, or with the example of the West Virginia teachers striking, you know, where you see the future of education going between being a public provision that is grounded in a unionized workforce with stable jobs, especially in many cases women and people of color, or whether you see a situation of an increasingly privatized, distributed educational system in which we're dependent on high-risk entrepreneurship.
So this is the last question. It's a really good one, I think, for us to kind of make our last remarks on, actually. So let's just start with Damien. We'll go down the line.
You're right. No, that's a big question, man. Again, I don't know where it's going to go. I just know that there's certain timeless things that you can, I mean, we're always going to have a need for problem solvers, right? And I think the more that we can put people's futures into their own hands, regardless of who's in office and regardless who's writing policies, I think they'll just be better served, you know? So that's my short answers.
Gosh, I think the question was about trends and things we see too, kind of rooted in that. What I guess I can speak to what I hope doesn't happen, and I do believe education is a public good, and to keep it that way, I would hope that it doesn't become solely privatized, because I think inherently that conflicts with the idea that it's a public good, and then you've got different interests. And so I will also say, and it was why I got into education while I'm not in policy now. I think there are a lot of people who make policy that have no business making policy because they've never experienced what it's like to be in education. And so if we can equip the people who have some experience, elevate their voices and hear them and let them provide input into the policies that need to be made, that would be a good trajectory for public education. So.
That's good.
How do we see the future, I guess? Just any statements you have on that.
Well, I think, firstly, well done for avoiding the political kind of answer to Betsy DeVos.
I'll hit on it, don't worry.
Okay. So, I don't know, I have nothing else to add. I think you guys did it really well.
All right. If you don't mind, I'll say something too. I think it's really important for the Secretary of Education to believe in public education. To any extent that that's not clear, it needs to become clear. And like Trudy said, the people who make big decisions about where resources go in education should be educators themselves who know what it's like to be in education. And I think there's a significant group of people with a lot of power and resources who see a lot of money to be made in education, and also who see pretty much no use for a big portion of the population that will be superfluous as more and more robots take over more and more jobs. And rather than thinking about how do we change the future of jobs, to maybe do something like sustainable infrastructure, addressing climate change, all kinds of things that a lot of people could be put to work on. I think a lot of people are thinking rather, we don't need those people, so let's create an education system that only a few people get through and everybody else gets prison pipelined, you know? So I really hope that doesn't happen, but in order for it to not happen, I think it's up to all of us. And it's up to anyone who's in education to do social justice education with students so that they understand that they're a part of this. This is the future they're inheriting. And I think we see with the Parkland students, with all different kinds of young people right now, that this is a question that there's no hesitation from young people on what they want to do. So thank you, everybody. Sorry to end on a political note, but thank you, everybody, for being here. Cool. Thanks to the panel.